to the Daily Bite. I'm your host, Pastor Steve Andrews. In our chapter today, 2 Samuel chapter 18, we're going to see this conflict between David and his son Absalom reach that peak critical point. Then David mustered the men who were with him and set over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. And David sent out the army, 1/3 under the command of Joab, 1/3 under the command of Abishai the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the command of Ittai the Gittite. And the king said to the men, I myself will also go out with you. But the men said, You shall not go out, for if we flee, they will not care about us. If half of us die, they will not care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us. Therefore it is better that you send us help from the city. The king said to them, Whatever seems best to you, I will do. So the king stood at the side of the gate, while all the army marched out by hundreds and by thousands. And the king ordered Joab and Abishai and Ittai, Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave orders to all the commanders about Absalom. So the army went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim. And the men of Israel were defeated there by the servants of David, and the loss there was great on that day, 20,000 men. The battle spread over the face of all the country, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword. And Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak, and his head caught fast in the oak, and he was suspended between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him went on. And a certain man saw it and told Joab, Behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak. Joab said to the man who told him, What? You saw him? Why then did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have been glad to give you 10 pieces of silver and a belt. But the man said to Joab, Even if I felt in my hand the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver, I would not reach out my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, For my sake protect the young man Absalom. On the other hand, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, and there is nothing hidden from the king, then you yourself would have stood aloof. Joab said, I will not waste time like this with you. And he took 3 javelins in his hand and thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. And 10 young men, Joab's armor-bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. Then Joab blew the trumpet, and the troops came back from pursuing Israel, for Joab restrained them. And they took Absalom and threw him into a great pit in the forest, and raised over him a very great heap of stones. And all Israel fled, everyone to his own home. Now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set up for himself the pillar that is in the king's valley. For he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. He called the pillar after his own name, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, Let me run and carry news to the king that Yahweh has delivered him from the hand of his enemies. And Joab said to him, You are not to carry news today. You may carry news another day, but today you shall carry no news, because the king's son is dead. And then Joab said to the Cushite, Go, tell the king what you have seen. The Cushite bowed before Joab and ran. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said again to Joab, Come what may, let me also run after the Cushite. And Joab said, Why will you run, my son, seeing that you will have no reward for the news? Come what may, he said, I will run. So he said to him, Run. Then Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain, and outran the Cushite. Now David was sitting between the 2 gates, and the watchman went up to the roof of the gate by the wall. And when he lifted up his eyes and looked, he saw a man running alone. The watchman called out and told the king, and the king said, If he is alone, there is news in his mouth. And he drew nearer and nearer. The watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called to the gate and said, See, another man running alone. The king said, He also brings news. The watchman said, I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz the son of Zadok. And the king said, He is a good man, and comes with good news. Then Ahimaaz cried out to the king, All is well. And he bowed before the king with his face to the earth and said, "Blessed be Yahweh your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king." And the king said, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" Ahimaaz answered, "When Joab sent the king's servant, your servant, I saw a great commotion, but I do not know what it was." And the king said, "Turn aside and stand here." So he turned aside and stood still. And behold, the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, "Good news for my lord the king. For Yahweh has delivered you this day from the hand of all who rose up against you." The king said to the Cushite, Is it well with the young man Absalom?" And the Cushite answered, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man." And the king was deeply moved, and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I have died instead of you? O Absalom, my son, my son." This is the word of the Lord. So we saw already in the previous chapter that they were mounting up for battle. David had fled. He had crossed the Jordan River to Mahanaim, and Absalom, with his army, the whole army of Israel, had given chase. They had actually crossed the Jordan River as well, but instead of going north toward the Jabbok River where Mahanaim is, they had decided to camp at Gilead, which is off to the south a little bit of it yet. They make their plans for battle, which includes those three commanders, Joab and his brother Abishai, and then Ittai the Gittite, who we just saw in the last chapter make that wonderful pledge of faithfulness to David. These three have been set over the army, and they are seeking to protect the king. They will not let David go out and join them in the battle. But before they go to fight, David gives them the command to deal gently, as he puts it, with Absalom. In other words, he doesn't want them to strike down his son. He wants his son to be left alive. There's a soft spot that remains in David for his own family, just as we've seen with Joab before, and we've seen with Absalom and Amnon even in the previous chapters of this book. In verse 6 and even verse 8, we get this idea that this battle ends up spreading out across the whole land of Israel. So first in verse 6, it's fought in the forest of Ephraim. Ephraim's on the west side of the Jordan. Both David and his army and Absalom and his army were camped on the east side of the Jordan. So it almost makes it sound as though David, at the start of this fight, took his army and marched them towards Jerusalem, and Absalom met them in battle. And so the fighting took place all across the land. We know it was rough. 20,000 die. The forest devoured more than the sword is an interesting statement. The idea that creation itself was involved in the battle that day, meting out the justice of God, perhaps we might say, as the creation we know, creation cries out. That's Romans 8. It mourns as well. In verse 9, we learn that Absalom got caught in a tree, and he's actually hung in a tree from the branches, and he can't get himself out. This actually goes back to Deuteronomy 21, verse 23, where we learn that anyone who is hanged in a tree is cursed by God. The question that we want to ask in our families then is, who else do we know of that was hung upon a tree? And this connects us to the New Testament, to Jesus, to Galatians chapter 3, verse 13, where Paul wrote for us that Jesus became a curse for us. Jesus was cursed by God in our place. With the section of verse 12 through 14, as we see the interaction of this man who had brought that report to Joab and then Joab himself, which of those two men is following the king's order? It's another conversation to have with your children. See that they can identify what's happening in the text here. David had given the order not to kill his son. The soldier knows that, and he won't lift up his hand, not for money, doesn't matter how much, he won't lift up his hand. And more so, he's even telling the commander, his commander in the army, Joab, that he's protecting Joab. If one of Joab's soldiers kills Absalom, then David would be upset about that. It would be just as though Joab himself had not kept the order. And so we see a faithful soldier here. But on the flip side, Joab's response is, I will not waste time like this with you. The idea of listening to the king's order was a waste of time for Joab. And instead, he carried out his own will and struck down Absalom and killed him. The interesting note in that, in verse 15, is that Joab had 10 armor bearers. That's a lot. I mean, when we read about Saul, for example, the king before David, he had one armor bearer. How much armor did Joab need? The burial of Absalom is with a great heap of stones. The idea, essentially, there of no escape. He's not getting out of this. This death is permanent. He is buried. And everyone returned home. Verse 18 first. We see Absalom mourning the idea that he had no sons to keep his name, which is interesting because we had learned 4 chapters before, chapter 14, verse 27, we learned that Absalom had 3 sons. So at that point, they must have all have already passed away. They must have died as children. Absalom's name, just as a note for you, means father of peace. Av is the Hebrew word for father. Shalom, peace. So he's the father of peace, which doesn't really fit with his life. We get the account of Ahimaaz wanting to run and give the report. He's done that before already. He's run to tell David with the words of Hushai from, well, Hushai the Archite from before. And even though Joab tried to stop him, probably in fear that Ahimaaz would be killed, as David has executed some men in the past who have brought him news, the one who brought him the news of Saul's death, the one who brought him the news of Ishbosheth's death. And so Joab tries to spare Ahimaaz of that here, but Ahimaaz refuses and says he's going to run anyway. And so Joab eventually lets him go. Ahimaaz was such a runner that in verse 27, the watchman sitting on the city gate there and watching recognized Ahimaaz simply for how the man was running. Imagine being recognized for something like that. That the people could see you and know it was you from a distance because of your style of running. Interesting. The biggest note here is going to be at the end of the text. As the Cushite delivers the news in a strange fashion, almost speaking it like a curse that Absalom is dead. May all of the enemies of the king be like him. But the bigger point is David's response. David mourns the death of his son. This is the son who has betrayed him. This is the son who has murdered his firstborn son, Amnon, who would have been the heir to the throne, out of cold-blooded vengeance. This is the son who has plotted for years to actually strip the kingdom away from his father. This is the son who has driven David, his father, out of his kingdom. This is the son who has essentially raped David's concubines in his own home in front of all the people of Israel. And David mourns for him, greatly wishes he could take his place. This is what we want to talk to our children about today. What made David so sad over the death of someone who betrayed him so greatly? There's a connection here that we want to make. And I hope you were picking up on it as I was talking through that. This is God in us. We have betrayed God. We have turned our backs on him. We have tried to force him out of his own kingdom. I mean, that's the people of God rejected God as their king and demanded a different king of their own, one of their own, to be king over them instead. And yet, God mourns for us. He grieves our rebellion. He grieves our sin, and he seeks to take our place by sending his own son, Jesus, to do just that, to take our place on the cross. So there's a definite connection. It's a conversation worth having as our families today, that we look to Christ, that God has loved us so dearly that he gave his own son for us, even though we had betrayed and rebelled against him. Praise be to God.